I was about to finish my work and leave the office when I heard it. Someone crying. My feet stopped right there. This voice? This was Francis's voice. My arrogant, cold boss, who never even smiled in front of anyone. He was crying. I slowly approached his office door. It was half open. Inside, Francis was collapsed in his chair, face buried in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. For the first time in 8 months I had seen him so broken. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across his usually pristine office. His tie was loosened, his perfectly styled hair disheveled. Papers were scattered across his desk, quarterly reports that he'd been obsessing over for weeks. But none of that mattered now. The man who commanded respect with just a glance, who made board members nervous with his presence, was falling apart. "Francis?" I whispered. He jerked his head up suddenly. Eyes red, cheeks wet. For a second we both froze. I'd never seen him like this. Vulnerable, raw, completely unguarded. His usual steel-gray eyes, the ones that could cut through any excuse or deflection, were now swimming with tears and something that looked like panic. "Sam," his voice cracked. What are you doing here?" I took a step inside, closing the door behind me instinctively. The office suddenly felt smaller, more intimate. I was about to leave but I heard, "Nothing. It's nothing." He quickly wiped his face, trying to put his professional mask back on. His hands were trembling as he reached for tissues from his desk drawer. "You should go. It's getting late." But I could see it. He was completely shattered. This wasn't the Francis who intimidated everyone in meetings, who could deliver crushing feedback without batting an eye. This was someone else entirely. Someone real. The silence stretched between us. Outside, the city lights were beginning to twinkle through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The building was almost empty, just the security guard downstairs and the cleaning crew that wouldn't arrive for another hour. We were alone in this bubble of raw emotion. "Francis, what happened?" I moved closer to his chair. "Tell me." His eyes met mine. Vulnerable. Raw. The carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself were crumbling in real time. "My father, he's in the hospital. Heart attack. The doctors, they don't think he's going to make it through the night." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd worked for Francis for 8 months and in all that time he'd never mentioned his family. I knew he was single, knew he worked late every night, knew he had no pictures on his desk except for company awards. I'd assumed he was just career-focused, maybe emotionally distant. I never imagined he was protecting something this precious. Words got stuck in my throat. I slowly, carefully reached out and touched his hand. It was warm, trembling like a leaf in a storm. His skin was soft, softer than I'd expected from someone who seemed so hard-edged. "I'm sorry," I whispered. And then something unexpected happened. Francis's tears started again, and he leaned toward me. Not completely, just slightly, like he was fighting with himself. Like every instinct told him to maintain distance. But his heart was overruling his head. "I don't know what to do, Sam." His voice was barely audible. "The doctors called an hour ago. Said I should come immediately. But I froze. I've been sitting here for an hour, just frozen." I pulled my chair closer to his desk. "What's stopping you?" "Fear." The admission came out like a confession. What if I'm too late? What if he dies while I'm driving there? What if the last thing we said to each other was an argument? Francis's composure was completely gone now. The man who could handle million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat was undone by the thought of losing his father. His breathing was uneven and I could see him fighting a full panic attack. "When did you last see him?" I asked gently. 3 months ago. We had dinner and I criticized his retirement plans, told him he was being financially irresponsible. He said I'd turned into everything he'd hoped I wouldn't become. Francis's voice broke on the last word. Successful but heartless. The pain in his voice was unbearable. I understood now why he kept everyone at arm's length, why he never let anyone see behind the professional facade. He was terrified of being seen as heartless, so he'd made himself appear exactly that. "Francis, you're not heartless," I said firmly. "You're scared. There's a difference." He looked at me then, really looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "How can you say that? You've worked for me for months. You know how I am." "I know how you act at work," I corrected. But I've also seen the way you remember everyone's birthday. How you quietly approve bonuses when people are struggling. How you stay late to fix problems so your team doesn't have to. You think you're hiding your heart, but you're not. Not really. Francis stared at me, and for a moment the crying stopped. You notice those things. I notice everything about you, I admitted before I could stop myself. The confession hung in the air between us. Francis's eyes widened slightly, and I felt my cheeks burn. This wasn't the time or place, but the words were out there now. Sam, he started, but I interrupted. We need to get you to the hospital, I said, standing up. Your father needs you, and you need to see him. Whatever happened 3 months ago, whatever words you exchanged, none of that matters right now. Francis nodded slowly, like he was coming out of a trance. You're right. I don't think I can drive. My hands won't stop shaking. Without hesitation, I held out my hand. Then I'll drive you. He looked at my outstretched hand like it was a lifeline. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and took it. His palm was warm and slightly damp, but his grip was sure. The moment our hands connected, something electric passed between us. Something that had been building for months, but had never had a chance to surface. Thank you, he whispered, standing up. I don't know why you're doing this, but thank you. As we gathered his things and headed toward the elevator, I realized that everything was about to change. Not just for Francis, but for both of us. The careful professional distance we'd maintained was crumbling, and I wasn't sure either of us was prepared for what would take its place. But as the elevator doors closed and I saw Francis's reflection in the polished steel, vulnerable, grateful, and for the first time since I'd known him, completely real, I knew there was no going back. Let's go to the hospital, I said immediately, my voice steadier than I felt. Francis shook his head, still wiping tears from his face. No, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm going, I said firmly, holding out my hand. Give me your car keys. The drive to the hospital was silent, but I could feel his tension radiating through the car. Francis sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the passing streetlights, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Every few minutes, his phone would buzz with updates from the hospital, and each time, his whole body would tense like he was bracing for the worst news. I wanted to say something comforting, but what could I possibly say? I'd never lost a parent. I'd never even seen Francis as anything other than my intimidating boss until an hour ago. Now I was driving him to potentially say goodbye to his father, and the weight of that responsibility felt enormous. Take the next exit, Francis said quietly, his voice hoarse from crying. It was the first thing he'd said since we left the office. The hospital parking garage was nearly empty at this hour. As I parked, Francis made no move to get out of the car. He just sat there, staring at the concrete wall in front of us. He used to take me to baseball games when I was a kid, Francis said suddenly. Every Sunday during the season, he'd buy peanuts and keep stats in this little notebook. He wanted me to love the game as much as he did. I turned off the engine and shifted to face him. Did you? No. I was too focused on homework, on getting into the right college, on building the perfect resume. Francis's laugh was bitter. I stopped going with him when I was 14. Said I was too busy. He never asked again. The regret in his voice was devastating. I could see him as a teenager, probably intense and driven even then, already building the walls that would define his adult life. Francis, I said softly, you were a kid. Kids don't understand. I wasn't a kid. I was old enough to know that those Sundays meant everything to him, and I chose my future over his feelings. Francis finally looked at me, and the pain in his eyes was raw. What kind of son does that? The kind who was taught that success was the most important thing, I replied. That doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. We sat in silence for another moment before Francis took a shaky breath and opened his car door. Let's go before I lose my nerve again. The ICU was a maze of sterile hallways and hushed voices. When we reached his father's room, Francis stopped outside the door like he'd hit an invisible wall. Through the glass, I could see an older man connected to various tubes and monitors, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. He looked so small, Francis whispered. When I was a child, he was my superhero. I moved closer, standing just behind his shoulder. He still is. Francis turned to me, eyes moist again. Sam, I've never been good at this. Emotions. Showing weakness. In business school, they taught us that vulnerability was a liability. This isn't weakness, I said softly. This is being human. Frances nodded but didn't move toward the door. A nurse appeared beside us, her expression kind but professional. Are you Frances Morrison? She asked. When Frances nodded, she continued. Your father's been asking for you. He's stable for now, but you should spend time with him. The words seemed to unlock something in Francis. He pushed open the door and walked slowly to his father's bedside. I hesitated at the threshold. This felt too private, too intimate for an employee to witness. Sam, Francis called without turning around. Please. I don't want to be alone. I entered the room and took a seat in the corner, trying to make myself invisible while still being present. Francis pulled a chair close to the bed and carefully took his father's hand. Dad? Francis's voice was gentle, nothing like the commanding tone I was used to hearing. Dad, it's Francis. I'm here. The older man's eyes fluttered open, and despite the oxygen mask and obvious weakness, his face brightened when he saw his son. Francis, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You came. Of course I came, Francis said, tears streaming down his face again. I'm sorry it took me so long. I was scared. His father squeezed Francis's hand with what little strength he had. Scared of what, son? Scared that you wouldn't want to see me. After our last conversation, after all the things I said. Oh, Francis. His father's eyes filled with tears. I could never not want to see you. You're my boy. My pride and joy even when you're being a stubborn fool. For the next few hours I watched Francis transform. The corporate mask completely disappeared, replaced by a son who was desperate to connect with his father before it was too late. They talked about baseball games and bedtime stories. About Francis's mother who had died when he was in college. About dreams and regrets and all the conversations they should have had years ago. Around 3 a.m., the doctor came in with an update. His father was stable but still critical. The next 24 hours would be crucial. When the doctor left, Francis broke down again. This time, without thinking, I went to him and put my arms around his shoulders. He didn't resist. Instead, he moved closer, hiding his face against my shoulder. Thank you, he said in a muffled voice. For staying. For being here when I couldn't handle this alone. Where else would I go? I smiled though he couldn't see it. My heart was racing. Not just from the emotional intensity of the night, but from the physical closeness, from the trust he was showing me. Sam, his voice was different when he spoke again. I don't know how. You don't need to say anything, I interrupted gently. But when he lifted his face to look at me, something between us shifted completely. We were closer than we'd ever been. I could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes, could feel his breath on my face. The professional boundaries that had defined our relationship for 8 months seemed as fragile as tissue paper. I've been thinking about you, Francis admitted quietly. For months, wondering what it would be like if I wasn't your employee, I finished. He nodded, his eyes searching my face. Is that crazy? No crazier than me thinking the same thing, I admitted. The confession hung between us in the quiet hospital room. Outside, dawn was beginning to break over the city, and I realized that everything about our relationship, everything about both of our lives was about to change. Francis's father stirred in his bed and we quickly moved apart, but the moment had already happened. The line had been crossed and there was no going back to the way things were before. The next morning at the office, Francis was completely different. Not the cold boss from before, not the broken man from last night. Something in between. Confused, maybe. Uncertain. I made coffee and walked to his office, my heart pounding with each step. Everything felt different. The familiar hallways, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. Even the sound of my own footsteps seemed amplified. I knocked softly on his doorframe. Come in, Francis called, his voice carefully neutral. He was standing by the window looking out at the city below. His suit was perfectly pressed again. His hair styled, his professional armor back in place. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clasped too tightly behind his back. How's your father? I asked, setting a cup of coffee on his desk. Better. Much better. Francis turned to face me and for a moment our eyes met. The doctors say he's going to be fine. Full recovery expected. That's wonderful news, I said, genuinely relieved. Sam. He interrupted before I could say more. About last night. I'm grateful for everything you did, but we should pretend it didn't happen? I completed his sentence, keeping my voice steady despite the way my stomach was dropping. Francis looked uncomfortable, adjusting his tie unnecessarily. This is a professional environment. There are lines we shouldn't cross. Lines? I almost smiled despite myself. Francis, you cried on my shoulder for 2 hours in a hospital room. I think we've already crossed those lines. He was speechless for a moment. Then slowly a real smile spread across his face. Not the polite, corporate smile he usually wore, but something genuine and warm. You're right, he admitted, moving closer to his desk. I don't know how to handle this. Handle what, exactly? Francis hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup. This closeness. With you. I've never allowed myself to get close to anyone I work with. Actually, I've never allowed myself to get close to anyone, period. Why not? Because. He struggled with the words. Looking everywhere except at me. People leave. They always leave. It's better to keep them at a distance than to let them get close and then watch them walk away. The vulnerability in his admission hit me hard. I understood now why Francis had built such high walls around himself. Why he maintained such strict professional boundaries. He wasn't just protecting his reputation. He was protecting his heart. I walked around his desk, closing the distance between us. Francis, I'm not going anywhere. How can you say that? His voice was barely above a whisper. You don't even know me. Not really. I know that you remember everyone's birthday and send flowers when their family members are sick. I know that you work 16-hour days not because you love the power, but because you're terrified of failing. I know that you keep a photo of your father in your wallet, but you've never shown it to anyone. I paused, watching his eyes widen with surprise. I know that last night when you trusted me with your pain, something changed between us. For both of us. Francis stared at me, his carefully controlled composure cracking. What are you saying, Sam? I'm saying that maybe it's time to cross some lines. The words hung between us in the morning air. Francis's office suddenly felt smaller, more intimate. I could hear the distant sounds of the office coming to life. Phones ringing, elevators chiming, conversations starting, but it all felt far away from this moment. Sam, Francis started, then stopped. He ran a hand through his hair, messing up the perfect styling. I've spent my entire adult life building walls. I don't know how to tear them down. You don't have to tear them all down at once, I said softly. Just let me in. A little at a time. Francis was quiet for a long moment, considering, then he did something unexpected. He laughed. A real genuine laugh that transformed his entire face. You know what's funny? He said. For 8 months, I've been trying to convince myself that what I felt for you was just professional admiration, respect for your work ethic. And now I realize I was lying to myself. Francis moved closer until we were standing just inches apart. I've been attracted to you since your first week. The way you handle difficult clients, the way you stay calm under pressure, the way you make that little face when you're concentrating on something important. My heart was racing. You notice when I make faces? I notice everything about you, Sam. The way you take your coffee, the fact that you always wear that silver bracelet on your left wrist, how you bite your lip when you're thinking. Francis's voice was getting softer, more intimate. I notice that you stay late when I'm working late, even when you don't have to. I notice that you always ask about my weekend, even though I never have anything interesting to say. The air between us was electric. This was Francis, my boss, my enigmatic, untouchable boss, telling me he'd been watching me, thinking about me, wanting me. Francis, I said, my voice barely steady. What happens now? I don't know, he admitted. I've never done this before. Mixed business with whatever this is. What do you want to happen? Francis looked at me for a long moment, his gray eyes intense and uncertain. I want to take you to dinner. I want to know what you're like outside of this office. I want to hear about your dreams, your fears, your family. He paused. I want to kiss you. The confession sent heat shooting through my entire body. Then why don't you? Because I'm scared, Francis said. Honestly. Scared that I'll mess this up. Scared that I don't know how to be in a relationship. Scared that you'll realize I'm not worth the complications. I reached out and took his hand, the same way I had in the hospital. His fingers immediately intertwined with mine, like they belonged there. Francis, last night you showed me the real you. Broken, scared, human. And I didn't run away. I squeezed his hand gently. I'm not going to run away from this either. Francis stared down at our joined hands, then back up at my face. This could get complicated. Office policies. People talking. Let them talk, I said, surprising myself with my boldness. I've spent 8 months pretending I don't feel anything for you. I'm tired of pretending. Something shifted in Francis's expression. Surprise, relief, and something that looked like hope. Sam, he said softly, would you like to have dinner with me tonight? Somewhere that's not the office cafeteria? Are you asking me on a date, Mr. Morrison? I'm asking you to give me a chance to show you who I am when I'm not hiding behind this desk. Francis replied, his thumb tracing across my knuckles. Yes, I said without hesitation. Yes, I'd like that very much. Francis smiled, really smiled, and for the first time since I'd known him, the smile reached his eyes completely. The professional mask was gone, replaced by something real and warm and hopeful. Outside his office, the business day was starting in earnest. But inside this glass-walled sanctuary, everything had changed. We were no longer just boss and employee. We were two people who had found something unexpected in each other, and we were brave enough to see where it might lead. Francis's father was on the road to recovery, but Francis and I, we were navigating daily awkward moments that left us both breathless and confused. At the office, we had to maintain our professional facade, but everything had changed. Stolen glances across the conference room during meetings, accidental brushes of fingers when passing documents, conversations that lingered far longer than necessary. It was all different now. The tension was killing me. Every morning when I brought Francis his coffee, our hands would touch for just a second longer than appropriate. Every evening when I'd knock on his office door to ask if he needed anything before I left, he'd look up from his computer with those gray eyes that seemed to see straight through me. And we'd both remember the hospital, the vulnerability, the admission that we'd been thinking about each other for months. Sam, Francis would say, and my name on his lips sounded different now, softer, more intimate. But then he'd catch himself, clear his throat, and ask me about quarterly reports or client meetings, and we'd both pretend that the air between us wasn't crackling with unspoken desires. The whole office could probably sense something had shifted. Maria from accounting kept giving me knowing looks, and even Jake from IT had commented that Francis seemed less intimidating lately. But we were careful, professional, dancing around each other like we were afraid one wrong move would shatter whatever fragile thing was growing between us. Friday evening, Francis approached my desk as I was shutting down my computer. The office was nearly empty, just a few dedicated workaholics scattered across the floor. Hospital? Francis asked quietly, his voice careful and neutral for anyone who might be listening. I looked up at him, noting the way his tie was slightly loosened, how his usually perfect hair had a small rebellious strand falling across his forehead. Is everything okay with your father? He's much better. Actually, Francis hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot. He wants to meet you properly, to thank you. The drive to the hospital felt different this time. Less desperate, less tragic, but somehow more intense. Francis kept stealing glances at me while I drove, and I could feel the weight of all our unspoken feelings filling the car like smoke. When we reached his father's room, the difference was remarkable. Mr. Morrison was sitting up in bed, color back in his cheeks, looking every bit the proud father Francis had described from his childhood. So this is your assistant? His father smiled warmly, his eyes twinkling with something that looked suspiciously like mischief. Francis has told me quite a lot about you, Papa. Francis looked mortified, a blush creeping up his neck. Son, you told me this young man stayed with you all night when I was critical, that he drove you here when you were too shaken to drive yourself. Mr. Morrison reached out and squeezed my hand with surprising strength. Thank you, Sam. You took care of my boy when he needed it most. The word boy made Francis flush even deeper, and I had to bite back a smile. It was endearing to see him through his father's eyes. Not the intimidating CEO, but someone's beloved son. We spent an hour with Mr. Morrison, who regaled us with embarrassing stories from Francis's childhood. Francis tried to change the subject multiple times, but his father was determined to paint a picture of a sensitive, caring child who used to rescue injured birds and cry during sad movies. He was always so serious, Mr. Morrison told me while Francis stepped out to talk to the doctor. Even as a little boy, he felt everything so deeply. I worried he'd learned to hide that sanctity too well. He hasn't lost it, I assured him. It's still there. Mr. Morrison studied my face carefully. You care about him. It wasn't a question, and I felt my cheeks warm. Yes, sir. I do. Good, he said simply. He needs someone who sees past all those walls he's built. Later in the hospital cafeteria, Francis and I sat across from each other with terrible coffee and vending machine sandwiches. The fluorescent lighting was harsh, but somehow Francis still looked beautiful. Tired, but beautiful. What did you tell your father about me? I asked, trying to keep my tone light and teasing. Francis looked flustered, his fingers nervously tapping against his coffee cup. Just that you're trustworthy, reliable, professional. Just that? Francis went quiet for a moment, staring down at his untouched sandwich. When he looked up, his expression was serious, vulnerable in a way that made my heart race. Sam, he said slowly, I need to tell you something. Tell me. That night, when I broke down, when you held me, Francis's voice dropped to almost a whisper. For the first time in years, I felt safe. Actually safe. My heart skipped a beat. The cafeteria around us faded away until it felt like we were the only two people in the world. Francis, I know this is complicated, he continued, his eyes never leaving mine. We work together, there are professional boundaries, company policies, but... He paused, taking a shaky breath. I can't stop thinking about you. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with months of suppressed feelings and careful professional distance. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could see the vulnerability in Francis's eyes as he waited for my response. I think about you too, I finally admitted, my voice barely audible. All the time. Francis's eyes widened, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. Really, really. I leaned closer across the small table, drawn to him like a magnet. But Francis, if we take this step, there's no going back. Everything changes. I know, he said, his voice strong and determined. And I don't want to go back. The conviction in his voice sent shivers down my spine. This was it, the moment we'd been building toward since that night in his office when I'd found him crying. The moment when we stopped pretending that what was between us was purely professional. So what happens now? I asked. Francis reached across the table and took my hand, right there in the middle of the hospital cafeteria. His palm was warm, slightly calloused from the tennis he played on weekends, and his fingers intertwined with mine like they belonged there. Now, he said, his thumb tracing across my knuckles, I take you on a proper date, away from the office, away from work, where we can just be Francis and Sam. Not boss and employee. When? Tomorrow night? Francis's voice held a note of uncertainty, like he was afraid I might change my mind. If you want to. I squeezed his hand, marveling at how right it felt to touch him this way. I want to. Francis's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. Good, he said, because I have 8 months of getting to know you to make up for. Francis's apartment was nothing like what I'd expected. I'd imagined something cold and minimalist, all sharp edges and expensive furniture that nobody was allowed to touch. Instead, it was warm and lived in, with books scattered on every surface, plants by the windows, and what appeared to be a collection of vintage baseball cards displayed in frames on one wall. You collect baseball cards? I asked, examining a 1952 Mickey Mantle rookie card. My father got me started when I was 8, Francis called from the kitchen, where he was cooking dinner. I kept collecting even after I stopped going to games with him. Felt like keeping a connection, I guess. The kitchen smelled incredible, garlic and herbs and something rich and savory that made my stomach growl. I wandered over to watch Francis work, and was surprised to see him moving confidently around the stove, stirring pasta sauce and tasting seasonings like he actually knew what he was doing. You can really cook? I asked, genuinely surprised. Bachelor for 10 years, Sam. Had to learn or survive on takeout forever. Francis smiled. and I noticed he changed out of his work clothes into jeans and a soft gray sweater that made his eyes look silver. Besides, I wanted to do something nice for you. The words were simple, but the way he said them, soft and almost shy, made my heart flutter. This was Francis without his armor. Francis in his own space, cooking for someone he cared about. It was intimate in a way that made me suddenly nervous. We ate slowly, talking about everything except the obvious tension crackling between us. Francis told me about his college years, his first job, the way he'd built his company from nothing. I shared stories about my family, my dreams, the things I'd never told anyone at work. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, like we'd been doing this for years, instead of hours. After dinner, we moved to his living room with glasses of wine. Francis had a gas fireplace, and he'd lit it despite the warm evening. The soft light made everything feel romantic, intimate, like we were existing in our own private world. "Sam," Francis said slowly, setting his wine glass on the coffee table. "Are you sure about this? About us? Why? Are you having doubts?" I asked, studying his face in the firelight. "No, I'm scared," he admitted, his honesty taking my breath away. "I'm not good at relationships. People eventually realize I'm too damaged, too closed off, and then they leave." The pain in his voice was evident, and I could see the fear in his eyes. Fear that I would be like everyone else, that I would get close enough to see his flaws and then walk away. "Francis," I set down my own wine glass and turned to face him fully. "You're not damaged. You're careful, protective. There's a difference. How can you be so sure?" "Because..." I moved closer to him on the couch, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. "When you trusted me enough to break down in front of me, when you let me see you at your most vulnerable, you showed me the real Francis. And I liked what I saw." Francis's breathing changed, becoming shallower, more uneven. The space between us felt charged, electric, like the air before a thunderstorm. "Sam," his voice was rough, uncertain. "Yeah? Can I kiss you?" Instead of answering, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. Our lips met, soft at first, tentative, like we were both afraid of breaking the spell. But then Francis's hand came up to cup my face, and the kiss deepened, became desperate, hungry, like we'd both been starving for this moment. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Francis rested his forehead against mine. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he whispered. "Just weeks?" I teased, my voice breathless. "Months," Francis corrected, his thumb tracing along my jawline. "Since you started working for me. Maybe since your first day, when you walked into my office wearing that blue shirt and completely reorganized my filing system without being asked." The admission sent heat shooting through my entire body. "You remember what I was wearing on my first day?" "I remember everything about you, Sam." Francis's voice was soft, reverent. "The way you bite your lip when you're concentrating, how you always smell like coffee and that cologne you wear, way you laugh at your own jokes when you think no one's listening." I stared at him, overwhelmed by the realization that he'd been watching me, noticing me, caring about these small details for months, while I thought he barely saw me as more than an efficient employee. "Francis," I started, but he interrupted me. "I love you, Sam." The words rushed out like he'd been holding them back for too long. "I know it's crazy, I know it's too fast, but..." I kissed him again, cutting off his worried rambling. This kiss was different, deeper, more certain, full of months of suppressed feelings and careful professional distance finally crumbling. "I love you too," I whispered against his lips when we separated. Francis pulled back to look at me, his eyes wide with wonder and disbelief. "You do?" "I do," I smiled, reaching up to smooth down the hair that had gotten mussed during our kissing. "I've been falling for you since that first night at the hospital, maybe even before that, and you let me see who you really are underneath all that professional armor." Francis's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. He looked younger, happier, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "So what happens now?" he asked, his hands still framing my face. "Now we figure it out," I said simply. "Together." Francis kissed me again, and this time there was no hesitation, no fear, just love and possibility and the promise of something beautiful beginning. We spent the rest of the evening talking and kissing and learning each other in ways that had nothing to do with quarterly reports or business meetings. Francis told me about his fears, his dreams, the loneliness he'd carried for years. I shared my own insecurities, my hopes for the future, the way I'd fallen for him gradually and then all at once. When it was time for me to leave, Francis walked me to the door, his hand warm in mine. "Tomorrow's going to be weird," I said, suddenly realizing we'd have to go back to being professional in front of our coworkers. "Probably," Francis agreed, but he was smiling. "But we'll figure it out. Together?" "Together," he confirmed, kissing me one more time before I left. As I drove home through the quiet streets, I couldn't stop smiling. Everything had changed in the span of a few hours. Francis loved me and I loved him, and somehow we were going to make this work. The future felt bright and uncertain and absolutely perfect. Monday morning at the office felt like stepping into an alternate universe. Everything looked the same. The familiar gray carpets, the glass-walled conference rooms, the smell of coffee and printer toner. But everything was different. Francis and I were different. We'd agreed to keep things professional during work hours, at least until we figured out how to navigate the complexities of an office relationship. But professional was proving to be nearly impossible when every glance across the bullpen made my heart race, when every accidental brush of fingers passing documents sent electricity up my spine. Francis was trying, God, he was trying so hard to act normal, but I could see the way his eyes softened when he looked at me, the way he had to consciously stop himself from smiling when I entered his office. During the Monday morning staff meeting, he kept stealing glances at me across the conference table, and I had to bite my lip to keep from grinning like an idiot. "Marson's in a good mood today," Jake from IT commented as we filed out of the meeting. "Did you see him almost smile when Henderson made that joke about the printer?" "Maybe he's getting laid," Maria from accounting said with a laugh. And I nearly choked on my coffee. If only they knew. The morning passed in a series of stolen moments. Francis's hand brushing mine when I handed him his messages. The way he said my name with just a hint of softness that no one else would notice. The secret smile he gave me when I brought him lunch and found him working with his sleeves rolled up and his hair slightly mussed. Around noon, Francis called me into his office. I knocked on the doorframe and entered, closing the door behind me out of habit. "Yes, boss?" I said playfully, unable to keep the teasing tone out of my voice. "Don't call me that," Francis laughed, standing up from behind his desk. "Not anymore." "Then what should I call you?" Francis walked around his desk until he was standing in front of me, close enough that I could smell his cologne and see the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled. "How about boyfriend?" My stomach flipped, heat racing through my body at the word. "Officially?" "If you want," Francis said, his voice softer now, more uncertain. "I know office romances are complicated. There are policies to consider. People will talk, we'll have to be careful about how we handle things professionally. But, Francis." I reached out and took his hand, stopping his worried rambling. "I don't want to be careful with you. I want to be real." "What does that mean?" "It means," I smiled, squeezing his fingers, "if you're ready to deal with office gossip, judgmental looks, complicated HR discussions, and whatever other drama comes our way, then yes, I want to be your boyfriend. Officially." Francis's face lit up like sunrise, hope and joy replacing the uncertainty in his expression. "Really? Really?" He kissed me then, right there in his office with the blinds open and the door unlocked. It was bold, brave, completely unlike the careful, controlled Francis everyone else knew. His hands came up to frame my face, and for a moment the rest of the world disappeared. When we separated, I laughed breathlessly. "Francis, anyone could have seen that. Let them," he said confidently, his arms still around me. "I'm tired of hiding. From you, from myself, from the world. And if people have problems with us being together, then they can discuss it with HR." Francis grinned, looking more relaxed and happy than I'd ever seen him. "I'm the boss, remember?" "My boss," I corrected, unable to stop smiling. "My boyfriend. You're everything, if you'll let me be." Looking into his eyes, clear, hopeful, completely vulnerable, I knew this was just the beginning. Not just of our relationship, but of Francis becoming the person he was meant to be. Open, trusting, always, I whispered. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of secret smiles and meaningful glances. We were still professional. We had work to do after all. but there was an undercurrent of joy, of rightness, that made everything feel brighter. At 5 o'clock, Francis appeared at my desk with his briefcase and jacket. "Ready to go home?" he asked, and the word home sounded different now, loaded with possibility. "Your place or mine?" I asked quietly, aware that several of our coworkers were still within earshot. "Mine," Francis said without hesitation. "I want to cook for you again." As we walked toward the elevator together, I noticed Maria watching us with a knowing smile. In the elevator, alone for the first time all day, Francis reached over and took my hand. "No regrets?" he asked softly. "None," I said firmly. "You, only that it took us this long to figure it out." The elevator doors opened into the parking garage, and as we walked toward Francis's car, I realized that everything in my life had changed in the span of a week. A week ago, Francis had been my intimidating, untouchable boss. Now he was the man I was falling in love with. The man who trusted me with his vulnerabilities and fears. The man who was brave enough to risk everything for the chance at happiness. "Sam," Francis said as we reached his car, stopping to look at me seriously. "I want you to know that it's not just about convenience or proximity or workplace attraction. I've never felt this way about anyone before." "What way?" "Like I can be myself," Francis said simply. "Like I don't have to pretend to be invulnerable all the time. Like someone finally sees me for who I really am and loves me anyway." My heart swelled with emotion, with love for this complicated, guarded man who was learning to open his heart. "I do see you," I said, reaching up to touch his face. "And I do love you. All of you." Francis leaned into my touch, his eyes closing briefly. "I love you too, Sam. More than I thought I was capable of loving anyone." As we drove to his apartment together, talking and laughing and planning our evening, I marveled at how quickly life could change. A week ago, I never could have imagined that the sound of my boss crying in his office would lead to this, to love, to partnership, to the beginning of something beautiful and real. But sometimes the best things in life come from the moments when we're brave enough to be vulnerable, when we're willing to cross professional lines and risk everything for the chance at genuine connection. Francis had taught me that, and I intended to spend a very long time showing him just how grateful I was for his courage to let me in. For the first time since I'd known him, Francis's smile reached his eyes completely, and I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together.